It all started on what seemed like an ordinary day. The office was as bustling as usual, with phones ringing, emails flooding in, and people rushing to meet deadlines. The air was thick with the hum of productivity. I sat at my desk, glancing over spreadsheets for my current project, when Mr. Thomas walked up to me. "Hey, Laura, could you stay late tonight? We have a huge client pitch coming up, and I need your help," he asked, flashing a warm, reassuring smile. Mr. Thomas, our director, was known for his larger-than-life persona. Charismatic, confident, and seemingly untouchable, he had a reputation for leading the team with a blend of respect and authority. I nodded without thinking too much about it. After all, it wasn't unusual for Mr. Thomas to ask for extra help when things got busy. It was a sign of trust, right? And with my recent promotion, I wanted to prove that I was more than capable of handling the additional responsibility. "Of course, Mr. Thomas, I'd be happy to help," I said, trying to sound confident. As the evening rolled in and the office began to quiet down, the usual energy had faded. Only a handful of people remained, heads down, working in silence. The only sound now was the occasional click of keyboards and the steady hum of the air conditioning. It was in this odd calm that Mr. Thomas sat down next to me, his chair scraping across the floor in an almost unnerving way. "You're really a valuable asset to this company, Laura," he said, his voice low and steady. "People like you don't come around often." I couldn't help but smile at the compliment, but something about the way he said it made me feel a little uncomfortable. It wasn't just his words. There was something in his gaze, a kind of lingering intensity that I couldn't quite place. "You've got a bright future here," he added, his tone dropping even further, almost conspiratorial. "If you stick with me, I can make sure you get everything you deserve." I chuckled nervously, unsure of how to respond. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas. I'm just here to do my best." He smiled again, but it was different this time, colder. "I know," he said, his voice more serious. "But the truth is, talent alone won't get you far here. You need to know the right people, and you need to play the game." At that moment, my gut twisted. There was something in his words that didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. After all, he was just trying to motivate me, right? I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had work to do, and I needed to focus. But as the night wore on, that uneasy feeling lingered, growing with each passing minute. Mr. Thomas had left for a while to handle some other matters, and I was left alone in the dimly lit office, staring at my computer screen, mind racing. Was I overthinking it? Or was there something more to his words? I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m. Tired and mentally drained, I decided it was time to pack up and call it a night. But as I stood up, gathering my things, Mr. Thomas returned. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. "Heading out already?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost as though he were testing me. I nodded. "Yes, I think we've made some good progress. I'll pick up where we left off tomorrow." But he wasn't ready to let me go just yet. He stepped closer, the smile still on his face, but this time there was a sharpness to it, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "You're doing great, Laura. I really appreciate all the work you're putting in," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "But don't forget, this is just the beginning. You've got a long way to go." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I nodded, my throat tightening, and made my way toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what that was. The next morning, I walked into the office with a mix of anticipation and lingering unease. It was supposed to be a fresh start after an exhausting evening, but everything felt different. The usual buzz of the office, the chatter of colleagues as they worked together, seemed louder, more intense. The world felt just a little more off. I sat down at my desk, trying to push aside the thoughts from last night. Maybe it's nothing, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the discomfort. After all, Mr. Thomas was just being his usual charismatic self, right? But then, I saw him, Mr. Thomas, walking down the hallway toward my desk. There was something about his presence that made my heart skip a beat. Maybe it was the way people parted when he walked by, or the air of authority that surrounded him. But today, something about his approach felt different. "Good morning, Laura," he said, his voice unusually warm as he stopped at my desk. "You're looking especially sharp today." I forced a smile. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas. Big day ahead." His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. "You're working hard, I can see that. People like you, Laura, they don't just get by on their talent. They have something else, something special." His gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, making my stomach twist. I couldn't quite place it, but there was an edge to his words that left me unsettled. "Thanks, I appreciate that," I replied, trying to focus on my screen. He nodded and gave me a brief, almost dismissive smile. "You've got a bright future, Laura. Don't let anyone hold you back." As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a cold shiver creep up my spine. There it was again, that strange, unspoken tension in the air. Was it just me? Or was he starting to watch me more closely? I buried my thoughts, telling myself to focus on the work ahead, but the words stuck with me. The day continued, but every time I looked up, Mr. Thomas seemed to be watching me, whether it was from his office or just passing by. His eyes would meet mine for a split second, and then he would quickly turn away, as if he knew I had caught him staring. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being scrutinized only intensified. It was as though something was lurking just beneath the surface, something I wasn't fully understanding yet. At lunch, I sat down with Sarah, a close friend at the office. We usually talked about everything: the latest office gossip, weekend plans, the usual small talk. But today, my mind kept drifting back to Mr. Thomas. I couldn't stop replaying his words and the look in his eyes. "Hey, you okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my distracted expression. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what was going on. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about some work stuff." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Work stuff? Or Mr. Thomas stuff?" My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice. "I don't know, Laura. It's just... people have been talking. Some of the others say he's been acting a little too focused on you lately. Watching you. Making things... uncomfortable." I stared at her in disbelief. "What do you mean, uncomfortable?" Sarah leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look, I'm not saying anything is happening, but it's been weird. I've seen him lingering around your desk more than usual, and I don't think it's just about the work. I'm worried, Laura." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was Sarah just overreacting? Or was there more to it than I realized? The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to bury myself in work, focusing on the upcoming client pitch that Mr. Thomas had emphasized so much. But even with my best efforts, I couldn't escape the growing sense of unease that clung to the office like a thick fog. It was like Mr. Thomas was everywhere. At lunch, when I stopped by the kitchen for a quick break, I'd turn around and there he was, standing just a little too close, offering a casual comment about the weather or my plans for the weekend. In meetings, his eyes would lock onto me with a piercing intensity, making me feel as though I were the only one in the room. I tried to shake it off, but no matter how hard I focused on my work, the nagging feeling that something was off never went away. Then, one morning, it all came crashing down. I had just settled into my desk when an email popped up on my screen. It was from Mr. Thomas. Subject: urgent. Let's talk after hours. I stared at the message for a moment, my pulse quickening. The tone was brief, but the words were unmistakable. He wanted to meet after hours to discuss the project. Again. My mind raced. I had already stayed late twice this week, and each time the conversation had grown more unsettling. Was it just work? Or was there something else going on? I glanced around the office, hoping to find some comfort in the faces of my colleagues, but they all seemed oblivious to what was unfolding. I couldn't avoid it forever, though. The email was clear, and I knew better than to ignore it. Mr. Thomas wasn't the kind of man who took well to being turned down. After a long day of back-to-back meetings, I found myself walking down the quiet hallway toward his office, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise still building. The office was empty, save for a few late-night workers hunched over their desks. The air felt thicker here, like the silence was pressing in from all sides. I knocked on Mr. Thomas's door, my heart hammering in my chest. "Come in," his voice called from within, smooth and calm. I opened the door and stepped inside, trying to mask the unease that had crept up on me. He was sitting at his desk, his back turned as he shuffled through papers. He turned around as I entered, flashing me a warm smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Laura," he said, standing up and gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. "I'm glad you could make it." I sat down, trying to appear composed despite the way my palms were sweating. Mr. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes fixed on me. "You've been doing great work lately," he began, his voice low, almost intimate. "Really impressive, Laura. You're exactly the kind of person I want to work closely with." I nodded politely, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I'm just doing my best." He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though trying to read my thoughts. "I can tell. You've got so much potential, more than most people here." His voice dropped lower. "But sometimes, potential alone isn't enough. You need the right opportunities, the right connections." I felt a chill run down my spine. His words seemed to hang in the air, thick with something I couldn't quite place. "Mr. Thomas, I appreciate your faith in me," I said cautiously. "But I'm happy with the work I'm doing. I'm just focused on the project right now." He smiled, but this time there was something unsettling about it. "Of course. But remember, Laura, no one gets ahead by just working hard. You've got to be willing to play the game, take the opportunities that come your way." I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. "I understand." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. "I've been thinking about your future here. I see a lot of potential in you, more than the others. That's why I want you to take charge of the client presentation next week. You'll be the one leading it. I'll be there to support you, of course, but this is your chance to really shine." His words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, but there was something else in them. Something darker. I nodded slowly, trying to hide the unease that was bubbling up inside me. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Thomas. I'll do my best." He smiled, standing up from his desk and walking toward the door. "I knew I could count on you, Laura. This is going to be big for you. Just remember, sometimes to get ahead, you need to align yourself with the right people." I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. As I walked out of his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a darkness in his words, a subtle pressure that seemed to be building with every encounter. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer just another employee. I was a pawn in a game I didn't fully understand. The next day, everything felt different. The office buzzed with its usual energy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes, something I wasn't fully aware of yet. Mr. Thomas's words from the night before echoed in my mind. Sometimes to get ahead, you need to align yourself with the right people. His tone was casual, but there was a certain weight to it that I couldn't ignore. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. I could feel his presence in the air, hovering just outside my peripheral vision, like he was always watching, waiting for the right moment to pull me closer. By noon, the atmosphere in the office had shifted. People were whispering in hushed tones, casting furtive glances in my direction. I couldn't help but feel like I was the center of some sort of unspoken drama. It didn't take long before Sarah, who had been my confidant for the past few weeks, approached me during lunch. "Laura," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow, suddenly alert. "What's going on?" She glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before she leaned in closer. "It's Mr. Thomas. People are talking about you. They're saying you've got his eye on you. Like, in a way that's making everyone uncomfortable." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked around again, her expression filled with concern. "I'm not saying anything is happening, but you need to be careful. He's been hovering around you. Not just for work, but in a way that doesn't feel right. And now, people are starting to notice." I felt my throat tighten as the weight of her words sank in. "What are they saying?" She shrugged, looking down at her food. "Whispers, speculations. I just don't want you to get caught up in something you can't control." I tried to maintain my composure, but the anxiety was creeping up my spine. "Thanks for telling me, Sarah. I'll keep an eye out." That afternoon, I walked back to my desk feeling more unsettled than ever. The whispers in the office were growing louder, and I could sense the shift in the way people looked at me. The camaraderie I had once felt with my coworkers now seemed like a distant memory, replaced with uncomfortable glances and half-hearted smiles. As the day wore on, I found myself growing more paranoid. Every time Mr. Thomas walked by, I felt like his eyes were on me, studying me, waiting for some sign of weakness. It wasn't just his gaze that unnerved me. It was the way he interacted with everyone else. He was charming, friendly, almost too perfect. But whenever he spoke to me, his words felt loaded, filled with meaning that I couldn't quite decipher. At the end of the workday, when most of the office had cleared out, I found myself once again walking down the empty hallway toward his office. This time, the familiar dread in my chest was accompanied by a sense of inevitability. I couldn't escape it. I had no choice but to face whatever it was that Mr. Thomas had in store for me. I knocked on his door, my hand trembling slightly as I did so. "Come in," he called smoothly. I entered, and there he was, sitting behind his desk with that same unsettling smile on his face. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes sparkling with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Laura," he said, his voice warm, almost too warm. "I'm glad you could make it. I know you're busy, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about your role here. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually." I sat down, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "I'm happy to discuss anything you need, Mr. Thomas." He smiled, nodding. "You've been doing great work, Laura. I can see how much potential you have. But potential isn't everything, is it? Sometimes, to truly get ahead, you have to take risks. You have to make the right choices. And I think you're ready for that." My stomach turned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think you're ready for something more than just this department. You've got the drive, the ambition, and I've been watching you. I want you to take charge of the next big project, the one with the top-tier clients. It'll be a huge opportunity for you, Laura, but it will also require you to step outside your comfort zone." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I didn't need him to say it outright. I knew exactly what he was suggesting, but I wasn't ready for it. Not like this. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something that big. He shook his head, his smile never faltering. You're more than ready. You just need to take the leap. Trust me, Laura. The rewards will be worth it. I wanted to refuse, to walk out of his office and put an end to this madness. But something held me in place. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I'll think about it, I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. He smiled again, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's all I ask. But remember, the offer won't stay on the table forever. As I left his office, I felt a sense of dread settle in my chest. I was trapped, caught between what I wanted and what he wanted from me. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep up the facade. The following days felt like walking a tightrope. Each step was calculated, each conversation carefully weighed, as I tried to navigate the tension that had built between Mr. Thomas and me. The whispers in the office had grown louder, and I could feel the weight of the stares every time I entered a room. The uncomfortable glances were now accompanied by half-formed smiles, as though everyone knew something I didn't. Or perhaps, something I wasn't ready to confront. Mr. Thomas's offer loomed over me, his words echoing in my mind every time I sat down to work. You've got the drive, the ambition, he had said. You just need to take the leap. But what was the leap? What did he truly want from me? Every time I thought about it, I felt like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. But I couldn't dwell on it for too long. I had a job to do, and I had to focus on the project at hand. It was the only way I could keep some semblance of normalcy in my life. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk, working through emails, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mr. Thomas. Let's talk. It's time to decide. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The message was short and to the point, but the meaning was clear. He wanted me to make a decision. The question was, what was I deciding? My stomach churned as I stared at the blinking cursor, wondering if I was ready to face whatever consequences came next. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding him. I had to respond. So, I walked down the hallway toward his office, my legs heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. The building was eerily quiet, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound I could hear. When I reached his office, I hesitated for a moment before knocking. His voice called from within, smooth as always. Come in. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. Mr. Thomas was standing at his desk, looking over some paperwork. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Laura, he said, smiling as he gestured for me to sit. I'm glad you came. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. You wanted to talk? He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. It's time to make a decision, Laura. The opportunity I've been offering you, it's yours if you want it. But the window is closing fast. His words sent a ripple of panic through me. This was it. The moment of truth. I could take the leap and step into whatever he had planned for me, or I could walk away and risk losing everything. Mr. Thomas, I began, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like this. I don't even know what it is you want from me. He smiled again, that same unsettling smile. It's simple, really. I want you to take charge of the biggest client we've ever had. You'll lead the presentation, make the decisions, and I'll be right there supporting you. But you need to prove you have what it takes. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The pitch was huge, a major deal that could make or break my career. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Mr. Thomas wasn't offering me a chance to shine. He was offering me a way into his web. You're offering me the spotlight, but for what price? I said, my voice steady despite the growing fear inside me. His smile faltered for a split second, but then it returned, colder than before. The price is simple: loyalty. If you want to succeed here, you need to trust me, Laura. I'm the one who can help you get what you want, but you have to be willing to play the game. The walls seemed to close in around me as I sat there, listening to his words. I realized then that this wasn't about work. This was about control. He wasn't just asking for my commitment to the company. He was asking for my allegiance to him. I had a choice to make. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't have a choice at all. Think about it, Laura, he continued, his voice low and persuasive. This is your chance to get ahead. All you have to do is trust me. I stood up, my heart racing. I'll let you know my decision tomorrow. Mr. Thomas nodded, that same calculating smile still on his face. Take your time. But remember, the offer is on the table only for so long. As I walked out of his office, I felt like I was suffocating. The decision had been made for me, whether I liked it or not. And as I made my way back to my desk, I knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The next day was a blur of emotions. I tried to focus on my work, but everything felt off. The office, once a place where I had felt comfortable and confident, now felt like a cage. Every conversation with my coworkers felt hollow, as though I was hiding a secret that everyone could sense but no one dared to ask about. The tension in the air was palpable, and I couldn't escape it. By the time I reached my lunch break, I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. I needed to clear my head, to find some semblance of peace before I had to make the final decision. But as I sat in the break room, trying to eat my sandwich, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sarah. We need to talk. It's about Mr. Thomas. My stomach dropped. I quickly typed out a response, telling her to meet me in the park after work. I couldn't keep going like this. I needed to know if I was just imagining things, or if there was truly something sinister going on. The rest of the day dragged on. Mr. Thomas sent me a few emails, each one more insistent than the last, reminding me that the opportunity was still there, waiting for me to claim it. But with each message, the weight of his words grew heavier. Every time I saw him in the hallways, his eyes would lock onto mine, and I could feel the pressure building, like a vice tightening around my chest. Finally, the workday ended. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the office, eager to put some distance between myself and the suffocating atmosphere. When I reached the park, I saw Sarah sitting on a bench, waiting for me. Her face was drawn, her expression serious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, standing up as I approached. "What's going on, Laura?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know what to do anymore, Sarah. Mr. Thomas, he's been making these offers to me, telling me I have to play the game if I want to succeed here. He wants me to lead the biggest presentation the company's ever had, but I don't think it's just about work anymore. I think he's trying to manipulate me." Sarah's eyes widened with concern. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew there was something off about him. People have been talking, Laura. There's a rumor going around that he's been targeting certain employees, getting them to do his bidding, pulling strings behind the scenes." I stared at her, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. "What do you mean? What's he been doing?" Sarah lowered her voice. "I don't have all the details, but people are saying that once he gets someone under his thumb, he starts making demands. Personal favors. Things that go beyond the workplace. He plays this game, Laura, where he makes you feel like you owe him, like you can't say no." My blood ran cold. "And what happens if you do say no?" "Some people have tried to walk away, but not many succeed," Sarah said, her voice grim. "He has a way of making sure they don't leave quietly. He makes sure they regret it." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had known something wasn't right, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Dangerously real. How do you know all this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated before answering. I've been here long enough to hear the whispers, and I've seen the people who've gotten too close to him. They all end up the same way, burned out, pushed aside, or worse. They don't get the opportunities they were promised. They're left with nothing. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The stakes were higher than I had realized. This wasn't just about a promotion or a career advancement. It was about something much darker. Mr. Thomas wasn't just offering me an opportunity. He was offering me a trap. What do I do, Sarah? I asked, my voice trembling. You have to be careful, she replied softly. If you take this offer, you're playing his game, and you don't know where it'll lead. But if you walk away, you have to be prepared for the fallout. He doesn't let go easily. I sat down on the bench beside her, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every decision felt like it would cost me something precious, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine. I don't know if I can do this anymore, I said, my voice cracking. I don't know if I can keep playing this game. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. You don't have to make a decision today. Just be careful, Laura. Watch your back. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of unease settle over me. I had always prided myself on being strong, independent, and capable of handling whatever came my way. But now, I wasn't so sure. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure if I could escape in time. The decision loomed over me like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake the thought that I was standing at the edge of a precipice, and no matter which way I stepped, I would be falling into something I didn't fully understand. I tried to focus on the work at hand, to drown out the constant buzz of uncertainty that had taken root in my mind. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the whispers grew. The next morning, when I walked into the office, the tension was palpable. The usual bustle of the office felt muted, as if everyone was holding their breath. I tried to push through it, telling myself that I just had to get through one more day. But every step I took, every glance from my colleagues, felt like I was walking through a minefield. When I reached my desk, there was an email waiting for me. It was from Mr. Thomas. The time has come. I clicked on it, my heart racing. The message was simple, just a few lines of text. Laura, I trust you've had time to think about the opportunity I mentioned. The time has come for you to make your decision. Let me know where you stand. I'll be waiting. The finality in his words hit me like a blow to the chest. There was no turning back now. I knew I had to respond, but I couldn't bring myself to do it immediately. Instead, I closed my email and sat there, staring at my computer screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The hours dragged by in a blur of meaningless tasks. The usual flow of emails and meetings felt like they were happening in another world, one where I didn't have to face the pressure of Mr. Thomas's demands. But no matter how hard I tried to escape it, the reality of the situation kept pulling me back in. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to respond. I knew what was expected of me, what I was being asked to do, but I wasn't sure if I could bring myself to take that first step into his world. I opened my email again, typing out a simple reply. Mr. Thomas, I've thought about your offer, and I'm ready to move forward. I'll take the lead on the presentation. Let's discuss the details. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and immediately felt a wave of dread wash over me. What had I just done? I had agreed to step into his game, and there was no going back now. Within minutes, Mr. Thomas replied, Excellent. Let's meet in my office after hours to discuss how we can make this happen. I felt a lump form in my throat. After hours. Again. I had been down this road before, and I knew what it meant. This wasn't just about work. This was about control. As the clock ticked down toward the end of the day, the anticipation in the office grew unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything, and every time I looked at the clock, I felt a pit in my stomach grow deeper. By the time the workday ended, I knew I had no choice but to face Mr. Thomas and whatever he had planned for me. I gathered my things, my hands trembling as I shoved papers into my bag. The office was quiet, empty now, save for the few stragglers still working. The silence felt oppressive as I made my way down the empty hallway to his office. When I reached his door, I knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Come in," he called. I opened the door and stepped inside. Mr. Thomas was standing at his desk, but when he saw me, his face broke into that unnerving smile. "Laura," he said, his voice smooth and almost too reassuring. "I'm glad you came. I knew you would make the right choice." I nodded, but the weight of his words felt like a chain wrapped around me. "I'm ready," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice trembled slightly. "Let's discuss the next steps." He walked around his desk and sat down in the chair across from me, motioning for me to sit. "You've made the right decision, Laura. This is your chance to prove yourself. The clients are important, but this project is about more than just them. It's about showing what you're capable of. And once you prove yourself, the doors will open for you." I forced myself to sit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer about work. This was about power. His power over me. "Tell me what you need from me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Mr. Thomas smiled, leaning forward slightly. "It's simple, really. You need to take charge. You'll lead the presentation, make the decisions, and I'll be right there to back you up. But you'll have to follow my lead, Laura. Trust me. I know what it takes to succeed here." I nodded, but inside, I felt a deep sense of unease. This wasn't just about presenting a project. This was about him pulling me deeper into his world, into his game. "You'll do well, Laura," he continued. "But remember, everything comes with a price. You can't get ahead without making sacrifices." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" He smiled again, that cold, calculating smile. "You'll understand soon enough." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation for the presentation. I worked late into the evening, perfecting every detail, rehearsing every line, and ensuring that everything was flawless. The pressure was immense, and every time I thought I had everything under control, a new doubt would creep in. Was this really just about the project? Or was it something more? Mr. Thomas had been in and out of the office, his presence looming over me like a shadow. He was always there, watching me, guiding me, but always with that unsettling smile, as if he knew something I didn't. Each time we spoke, the same undertone was present, the same suggestion that I had to give more, do more, prove myself in ways I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I had agreed to take the lead on the presentation, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just taking charge of a client pitch. I was stepping into a role I wasn't sure I could escape from. Mr. Thomas had made it clear that this wasn't just about showcasing my abilities. It was about aligning myself with him, trusting him, following his lead. The night before the big presentation, I stayed late in the office again, tweaking the final details of the slides. The building was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint click of my keyboard and the hum of the air conditioning. I glanced at the clock and saw it was almost 9 p.m. I was exhausted, but I couldn't afford to stop now. Not when everything was riding on this. Suddenly, the door to the office opened, and there stood Mr. Thomas, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. His presence was unmistakable. "Still working?" he asked, his voice smooth and casual. I looked up, forcing a smile. Yes, just finishing up some last-minute details. He walked over to my desk, his footsteps almost too soft, as if he were trying to avoid making any noise. You've been putting in a lot of effort, Laura, he said, his tone low and almost admiring. That's exactly what I like to see. People who are willing to go the extra mile. I nodded, trying to mask the unease that was building inside me. I want to make sure everything's perfect. He leaned over my shoulder, his face so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin. You're doing great. You're going to make a real impression tomorrow. I have no doubt about that. I forced myself to focus on the screen in front of me, even though I could feel his eyes on me. Thank you, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move away, though. Instead, he placed a hand on the back of my chair, his fingers brushing lightly against my shoulder. You know, Laura, you really do have what it takes. I see something special in you. I knew from the moment I brought you onto this project that you were going to be a star. I stiffened, his words sending a chill down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to stop, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk it. Not when everything I had worked for was on the line. You've got to trust me, Laura, he continued, his voice soft, almost coaxing. Everything I'm doing for your benefit. This is the way forward. You're not just going to make an impression tomorrow. You're going to set the stage for the rest of your career. I nodded, but the words felt like they were suffocating me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the presentation. It was about me becoming part of his game, his world. And I wasn't sure if I could ever escape. When he finally pulled back, he gave me one last look, his gaze lingering on me just a little too long. I'll be watching tomorrow, Laura. Don't disappoint me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just nodded, too afraid to say anything else. As he left, I sat there in the silence of the empty office, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. What had I just agreed to? And how deep was I really in? I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had crossed a line, and there was no going back now.